Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first ever FinTech Summit from the GSMA. Delighted to see you. You're most welcome, and we hope you have a really enjoyable session. And if you stay with us for the day, likewise, you enjoy the rest of the day. My name's Gorman. I'm the FinTech lead of the GSMA. So on behalf of my colleagues and our sponsors, welcome. I'd also like to thank Accenture and Citi for all the work they've done to help get ready for today. Today's session is on scams. So we've got a brilliant panel of people who day-to-day work on designing, creating, and deploying solutions to fight scam attacks. So the way the session will work is that Zhang will do a short presentation, and then we'll have a panel discussion to go into a little bit more detail. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Zhang to come up and do his presentation.
Thanks, Brian. Just a short introduction of myself. I come from Ant Group. I'm the solution architect of Ant Group. The department I come from work to develop solutions for securities. So we develop identity verification solutions, anti-money laundering solutions, as well as risk management solutions to safeguard payment transactions in Ant. The second responsibility is that we also commercialize the product and offer it to markets. In order to do so, we create a brand. The brand is called Zolos. So there's a brand created for Zolos is Z-O-L-O-Z. It's a brand that we use to provide a solution to the market. Security is a very broad topic. In today's presentation, I'm going to focus on scam, how we anti-scam in Ant Group. I'm pretty sure you could agree with me that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the digital adoption. At the same time, we also observe that the scams has become more and more rampant. From a research, from July to October last year, every month there are over 4 billion scam calls made worldwide, right? According to CNBC, 23% of Americans reported that they have lost money due to a phone call scam. That's very serious. I also list down the money lost in US, UK, and China. Sometimes it's not just money. In very extreme and tragic cases, people lost their families and lives due to scam. Therefore, since 2017, Ant Group has invested our team to develop an anti-scam solution. But this is the solution look like. At the bottom layer, this is due to the first challenge we faced from scam detection. We realized that as a payment app, we don't have complete information. For example, the scam might be conducted on a social media or messenger app for weeks until it reaches us. When we receive the scam, it could be the last moment when the transaction is made. Therefore, we make use of multi-party computation to allow external party sharing data with us. On top of data layer, there is model layers. There are models to give prediction on what are the group people are more vulnerable to scams, what are the scam score for the current transactions, and what are the pattern of scams. On top of model layer, this is the second challenge we face. We used to think solution from our product, right? When we identify risk, we set to pending. We discharge risk through user authentication. However, for a scam transaction, it doesn't work. The user willingly wants to transfer money through our app. All the user authentication doesn't work in this way. Therefore, we've transformed from product-centric to user-centric. There are 4 pillars mentioned here: aware, detect, awaken, and report. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus each one of them. First, awareness creation. This topic sometimes is overlooked by companies. However, in my opinion, this is the most important. If we can prevent a scam before it happens, that would be great. There are 2 channels of awareness creation. One is in-app creation. So we build the library of content. We also build an algorithm trying to figure out when, how, and what to display to the user. I list 3 formats. One is a simple content display, highlights the scam trend. Second format is to let user feel satisfied to the quiz or challenge. Third format is a situation story. It is basically like a comic book. User gain knowledge to reading the story. There are also out-of-app communication. For example, we launched a campaign with hundreds of universities in China. It's called Fraudless Campus. So we go on site, provide training and lectures to the students to let them learn how to protect themselves. There's also the sport role-playing games. It's a physical board games. You can choose a role to play, and at a certain stage of game, you will suddenly realize that you are actually the victim of scam. We want to make use of sudden realization moment to teach everybody how to protect themselves. The second part, detection. Of course, for all the risk management system, there are more than one algorithm. I just want to focus on the most major one. It is called graph-based algorithm. Different from conventional database, where we store data in different tables. In OnGroup, we store information on a graph. You can imagine every user, every merchant, every device of OnGroup as a node of this graph. The transaction forms edges to link the nodes together. So we build a single source of truth, a single graph, which contains every information we want to use for risk analysis. There are two methods highlighted here. One is more intelligently. It's basically to train an algorithm. It is based on graph neural network, GNN algorithm. It's based on deep learning. So AI is trained by us to tell whether this is a good transaction or bad transaction. The example shown here is that AI is able to figure out two syndicates from all this graph data. The second type of calculation or computation is called graph computation. It is leverage our expert knowledge. Through observation of transactions, experts can form their knowledge. For example, they can figure out a pattern of a scam, and they can program in our system so that the system will do the graph search and graph match. Whenever there's match case identified, it will send an alert. So that's a two use case for graph computation. The third step is awakening. As I mentioned, we can't rely on user authentication. We have to figure out other methods to discharge risk. So therefore, we introduce a very interesting authentication method based on interaction with end user. We call it interactive risk management. The idea is that after the first decision made by risk engine, if we think it's a scam case, we're going to figure out a way to interact with end user. So there's a risk engine, interaction risk engine, figure out what to interact with end user. There are multiple formats. It can be through a robot call. It can be through a bot chat in the app. It can be through a questionnaire. The idea is that to get a response from the user, firstly, to determine whether this is a scam or not. Secondly, to awaken the user, to remind them they are in the process of scam. And then there will be a second decision made from this risk engine. So we're going to do a triage. For those high-risk transactions, we're going to stop it. For the medium-risk transactions, we're going to defer payments. We're going to allow 24 or 48 hours for the user to resync whether they want to continue the transaction. For the low-risk transactions, we're going to notify the user. We're going to let them know that you are in process of a scam, but you can choose to continue. So that is the interaction risk management solution from OnGroup. Of course, I guess most of us are very curious about how this interaction is performed. We actually train the algorithm. Of course, we leverage on natural language processing, natural language understanding, to translate speech into text, to translate text into vector, which can be understood by AI algorithm. However, in order to interact with the end user, we also have to come up with a new algorithm. It is called active reasoning dialogue. The idea is that we're going to take all the known facts, all the known information to AI as a state. And then the task of AI is to give a prediction of action. The action will be sent to the user to get the response. With the response, further information is included in the algorithm, which will form new state. And then the AI has to predict the next action. How we train the algorithm? The reward is given by considering two factors. First, it has to take care of identification of risk. Second, it has to balance user experience. So every time user gives a response, we're going to send the response to the algorithm. Algorithm is trying to capture the intention of this user. They're going to figure out, is this user trying to answer my question? They're going to figure out, is this user trying to lie to us? This is important because the victim sometimes is so convinced by the scammer, they try to lie. They try to get to the authentication. So you have to figure out whether they are lying to us. We're also trying to figure out the sentiment of the user, whether they are happy or whether they are sad. So this is the last function, reporting. This is a one-stop solution. The victim can send us evidence and data so that we can analyze and review and provide the results. If we think it's a scam, we're going to punish the reported account. We might even blacklist it. And then we're also going to use the evidence and data reported to us to send to the algorithm to further improve the accuracy. So you complete the loop. Lastly, I want to highlight scam is not just a company or the industry problem. It is a problem that requires further collaboration. Right now, we are working with police department in China as well as a few major banks to offer them our capabilities. If you think there's synergy between your company and our product, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to have a chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Zhang for a super presentation. We're delighted he could join us from Singapore to share that insight on Ant Group. And now I'm going to be joined by my other colleagues for the panel. So Telefónica, iconectiv, Prove, as well as Zhang will join us on the panel now. George, perhaps as we're sitting down, perhaps I could ask you to start to introduce yourself and the work that iconectiv do, please.
Okay. Hi, I'm George Cray, Senior Vice President of Product at iconectiv. If you're not familiar with iconectiv, we're an authoritative partner to the communication industry, and we have basically cloud-based software as a service platforms and solutions, and trusted communication platforms that span network and operations management. We also have numbering solutions, business to consumer communication, and fraud protection. Basically, iconectiv interconnects networks, devices, and applications for more than 2 billion people every day.
Super, thank you, George. Keiron?
See if I can.
Just keep it latter.
Yeah, I'll go for that. Yeah. So you may know Prove as Payphone. We were rebranded a couple of years ago, but we've been operational now for 10 years. We have a very straightforward premise. It's a phone-centric view of identity. So the idea being that leveraging somebody's phone number, in essence, as a method to establish both verifying identity, authentication, or even through to things like transactional risk. My personal responsibility is for the UK and EMEA. And appreciate the opportunity.
Super, thank you. Glyn?
Glyn Povah. I look after global product development at Telefónica Tech. Telefónica Tech is one of Telefónica's big growth businesses, and I work in the IoT and big data division. And in my team, we've been very focused in the last 4 or 5 years in developing a business insights API B2B business. Focused on risk signals and insights on consumer behavior on mobile phones for all of Telefónica subscribers in our main markets, so UK, Spain, Germany, and Latin America. And we've been collaborating actually with the ecosystem side with other operators because it's a non-competitive product set. We're only selling insights for our own subscribers with GSMA and also with financial service providers where we address with our insights and our API services a lot of fraud and scam use cases, some of which I'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, super, thanks, Glyn. So I want to start off by exploring some of the kind of fraud trends, and then when we've done that, we'll get into some of the solutions that the guys have built. So George, from your perspective, what are some of the trends that iconectiv is seeing?
Sure. I think one of the areas that we definitely see, and Zhang kind of pointed out around robocalling, the CLI spoofing or caller ID spoofing is a problem globally. We in the U.S., where I'm based, we've seen it tremendously impact the ability of consumers answering phones. I've read statistics that said there are 85 billion fraudulent robocalls occurring globally, and we see statistics like 70% of people just stop answering the phone because they don't trust the caller and the caller ID. And from that perspective, it's starting to make the voice calling almost useless and very costly for all companies involved. So it's a big challenge.
Thanks, George. And Glyn, from your perspective as an operator that operates in many markets around the world, what's Telefónica's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an interesting time. You know, George highlighted some of the scams and the growth in you know, social engineering via, you know, voice, SMS also, so a lot of our key channels. And I think, you know, during the pandemic, we saw, you know, nearly 200% growth in voice calls on the voice channel, which was great because it's, you know, as a telco, we're all about connecting people, and this was about, you know, families and businesses connecting with each other. But, you know, of course, the other side of that is, you know, there's fraud and scams happening. I think if you look at some of the data from Hire, who do the state of the call report from 2021, they were saying, actually, you know, there's about 150 scam calls per person per annum, and about half of those are fraudulent calls. So, you know, while we're connecting people and families together, we're also, you know, allowing scammers to reach consumers as well. And, you know, we're really focused now on actually developing solutions to actually help enterprises and consumers really kind of solve those problems and bring that fraud down and bring trust back into communications.
Yeah. And Keiron, from your perspective, what do you see, given your role in the ecosystem? What are the kind of trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, one of the things that I'd like to highlight actually is the human element of this, and I know we've kind of touched on that, but from our perspective, particularly with the proliferation of all the kind of digital expansion and transformation, it's exposing more and more people to digital processes. And so from our perspective at that cold face and dealing with a number of large enterprises, a lot of the challenges typically are centered around whether it's the vulnerable who's not used to a particular process, or whether it's just purely down to inclusivity. So we're trying to enable processes and new solutions, particularly remotely, has just enabled a whole new world of challenges, particularly around scams. So from our perspective, taking the technology out of the way, it's just being cognizant of the human being at the center of it. So from a trend perspective, it's always that. It's human first.
Yeah. Zhang, just building on Keiron's point, super presentation. What are the main use cases or the main scam attacks that your solution is actually protecting customers from?
We have seen romance scam. We have seen investment scam, and sometimes it's a part-time job earning scam. All tackle to the weakness of humanity. But most importantly, we have observed that scam has become much more sophisticated and covert. It is quite difficult for the individual to tell. I mean, they are so-called well-targeted, precise targets at the victim. They do the social engineering and understand their background. They figure out you like investments, so they create a group. Everybody else is a scammer. You are the only victim. They let you download the app and basically make investment there. They're going to give you some incentive for the first round investments. They're going to give you bonus until the moment you trust them, and then you're going to invest all the money. And that's the time they stop it.
Yeah. Thanks, Zhang. I'm really keen now to kind of get into some of the detail now of the solutions themselves. So, George, from your perspective, I know a lot of iconectiv's work is focused on call authentication. So can you just tell us a little bit more about how that works and what's the current status?
So, Brian, in the U.S., we've implemented STIR/SHAKEN. So both U.S. and Canada took that international standard of STIR and came up with a mechanism to cryptographically sign IP calls. So this is really a measure to stop the spoofing of these robocalls. And so you would have a originating service provider actually attest that the phone call is legitimate. And that way, the consumer receiving that, the terminating service provider would check to make sure that none of the signatures were tampered with, and can deliver the call and more or less affirm that it should be trusted. And so the first 3 months that that was rolled out actually reduced robocalling by 29%. Now, it's really a journey because, again, it's about knowing your customer and always understanding where that call is beginning is sometimes a challenge. There's always a lot of cross-border as calls come into the country, and that would be true in probably most regions around the world. You end up with a very difficult time policing kind of what is coming into a telco's network and ensuring that you really can know the origin. So that's what we've started in the US. iconectiv is actually a policy administrator for StirShaken, and we see this evolving. We have up to 430 service providers now that have registered, and we continue to roll out enhancements, including things like adding rich call data to the information that can be passed along. So things like calling name, calling reason, logo, and these are things that enterprises would love to have presented to consumers.
Thanks, George. And Glyn, I think you mentioned it when you were talking the work that Telefónica's been doing. So can you tell us a little bit more about that work in the UK, please?
Yeah, so we started a while ago with, as I said, B2B APIs and basic insights like, SIM swap timestamp. So letting banks understand when the last time SIM swap happened for a subscriber, and they can use that information very simply to decide, whether to send a one-time password to the customer or not if there's a recent SIM swap. And I think that's been hugely effective in UK and our other Telefónica markets at cutting down SIM swap fraud. I mean, we've seen that in the news actually in Spain recently, but also in the US. The FBI has published a lot of data that, a lot of people with crypto accounts are now being, so the fraudsters move around. They're very smart, and they adjust their kind of tactics to go for different targets. But I would say the most recent one, which I know Zhang had actually in his presentation, was what is called in the UK APP fraud, but it's basically social engineering via a voice channel to convince customers to empty their bank accounts and transfer money over the course of one call or 2 or 3 calls to the fraudster's bank account. Sometimes tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, and of course with crypto as well, that's in the mix as well. And again, we've worked with the industry, with GSMA, with our partner networks, Vodafone and BT in the UK, but also more on a European basis with Orange, DT, and other telcos, and our customers most importantly. So with the banks, with the partners, customers like Prove, which Keiron represents, to develop again another simple insight. So we did a lot of data science work with some leading banks in the UK, looking at fraud cases, known fraud and not fraud cases. I think what we saw was actually there's a really high propensity for customers to be on a voice call, in other words, being socially engineered during the time which the financial traction took place in terms of the fraud. And so we took that insight, and we've now deployed a simple product in the UK that lets banks understand, is the subscriber on an active voice call at that moment, and they can use that insight to drive their decision-making around, fraud and, what the customer experience should be in that situation. I think it's a really good example of industry collaboration, simple problem, simple solution to a really big problem, and a lot more to come with AI and machine learning as well.
Super, thanks. Thank you. Keiron, I know that you've been extensively involved in that. Could you give us your perspective and what Prove did to help shape that solution?
Yeah, so on a personal note, I've been involved in this ecosystem for a while, and what I would say is that right now the collaboration is probably as strong as it's ever been, if not stronger. So we deployed a solution which I think the parlance is number verify, that's kind of a global terminology. But fundamentally, we were part of an ecosystem that helped enable that in the UK with the help of the telcos, the GSMA, and some of the leading banks. As a result of the success of that, which has led to, in some instances, 6-figure fraud savings per month, due to the reduction in reliance of things like SMS OTP, we were actually invited into this project around scams, an APP in particular. And so we're now in a situation where we're connected to a telco, soon to be two telcos, and a tier one bank in the UK. We're monitoring somewhere between 250 and 500,000 transactions on a daily basis that are fundamentally flagged as high risk. And what we're trying to establish is ultimately, one, how does that call impact in terms of the transaction? But also, and this is critical, it's the positive element. So can we leverage this to ensure that the positive transactions continue to go through? So lowering false positives and enabling the good fundamentally. But we're seeing some really good anecdotal feedback already, where thousands and thousands of pounds worth of certain fraud cases where we've essentially flagged something would have stopped certain fraud. So it's very positive at this early stage.
Thanks. I'm not sure I asked you, so forgive me, what's the scale of APP fraud in the UK? Well, I can't remember if we actually said that figure. Yeah,
so I think you had it on the slide before. So as of last year, it was somewhere around £750 million. Yeah. It's a problem that's continuing to grow as well. Yeah. So it's pretty much the #1 fraud issue in the UK currently.
Super, thanks, Keiron. Zhang, if I can come to your solution, can you give us a feel for scale, the number of transactions, and also, obviously it's a predictive model, so how do you ensure it's still being as predictive as it needs to be?
Yeah, so scale is definitely something we should work on, because we provide solution for Alipay app, which is used for Double 11 event of Alibaba e-commerce festival. So basically, we have to handle quite a large number of transactions in a short period of time. Yeah. So come back to how we handle the scalability issue. So the system we can deploy on-premise to our customers' so-called environments. We also build a SaaS product, basically on cloud. There are 5 so-called main capabilities we shall highlight. To easily remember, it's basically called image. IMAGE. I stand for interactive, which I just talked about. M stands for multi-party computation, which is also talk about sharing data from different parties. A is the adversarial training. So the AI is able to generate the negative cases and use them to train the AI. And then with evolved AI, additional AI will also generate additional negative cases to keep AI evolved. That's how we solve the training issue. Yeah. And also G stands for graph computation. The last one, Edge. Edge is a solution for scale. Edge is enable the mobile phone to make a decision. So they have algorithm embedded in the mobile phone SDK instead of in the cloud. So for those simple transactions, 99% can be made decision by the mobile phone. And then for the 1% particular transaction, we're going to send to the backend to enable our cloud-based risk engine.
It's interesting you mentioned 11/11 because that's the biggest commerce event in the whole of the world. So to try and kind of run your scoring model on that kind of scale of transaction must be a real challenge. So, George, can we come back? I mean, it's great progress on Shaken to get it implemented, get started. What's the vision? Where's it going?
Sure. I believe, when you look at where it is a journey. I mentioned the 430 service providers, and it's now pushing more to the more rural and smaller carriers. But one of the challenges with Stir, it's all based on IP calling, and so if you don't keep that call completely IP, you could actually lose the cryptographic signature. And so they're looking at augmenting with out-of-band Shaken as ways to keep the information so that a terminating phone call, you can say is trusted. The other thing we've done is we've partnered with CTIA. They're a trade association in the US for the wireless industry. And what we've done is come up with a centralized registry where enterprises can go ahead and be vetted and then also register their phone numbers, which can be shared with all the service providers in the ecosystem. And so that's shared with all so that they can better attest phone calls when they go through the network.
Do you see the vision being just staying as a US-centric thing, or has it got a global opportunity?
Yeah, so some of the challenges I mentioned with the cross-border influx of spoofed robocalls, really there is a challenge to say, hey, how do we handle, whether it's stir shaken or other forms, how do we accept a know your customer signed call coming into the U.S.? And so there are discussions with the governance authority in the U.S. on what to do about cross-border calls, how do we let others come into the ecosystem. The FCC added a robocall mitigation database that they put in the U.S. In order for foreign service providers to register. So it's kind of a mix of tools that are being used to better attest calls and deliver those calls. And I think ultimately, knowing your customer and delivering a signed call or text is ultimately where we're going to need to get to.
Global standard, though? Could you see it becoming much more than just a North America proposition?
I do believe, you'll see cryptographic signatures of calls and the use of stir, whether it be stir shaken itself or some other variations, as something that needs to happen across countries and become somewhat of a global standard.
The new solution's been deployed, it's making a difference. What's next? What's next?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super interesting time, actually, to be having this conversation about, I talk about the trust ecosystem, and I talk about that in telco terms. So when I talk about trust, it's about voice calls and SMS and how to connect businesses with consumers, and, vice versa. And I think what we're seeing now actually is a lot of the tools already exist to achieve that for us as telcos. I mean, George talked about stir shaken, but you've got verifiable credentials, you've got DIDs, you've got a trend towards reusable identity, which is a much more consumer-focused ecosystem. And I think you can say, well, are consumers really interested in identity? I think the answer is no. And are consumers interested in fraud and scams? They're not until they get scammed themselves. But we have a duty, I think, and probably a business opportunity to offer our enterprise customers, our consumer customers, the opportunity to verify that they are who they say they are. When I'm calling my bank or when my bank is calling me, I want to know that Barclays Bank is who they say they are when I answer the phone. And we're going to have the tools to do that in the very near future. And I think makes it really exciting, next few years in this trust ecosystem.
Keiron, when you were talking, you mentioned collaboration. How do we replicate that in other markets around the world? What do we need to do to try and create that same collaboration?
Well, using the UK as an example, for me, the successes have been mainly because it's focused on the tangible. So where there are known issues or where there are known problems that can be resolved, or there's a discussion to be had at least, we've very quickly gone into that kind of testing and understanding of that data science phase. Without plugging the GSMA too much, leveraging the GSMA to pull telcos, UK finance, and a number of the vendors such as ourselves together to talk about, the art of the possible and testing some of this out. Fundamentally, that's got us to a position far quicker than just simply a talking shop. So for me, as we're moving into other geographies, other territories, other sectors even for that matter, we always typically start with a data exercise, a data study, and also starting with that concept of, okay, if we're going to do this right, let's start privacy first, security first, build out, but understand where the value is and understand quickly. Likewise, understand if there isn't any value, get to the know quick. So for me, that's critical.
And Zhang, from your perspective on your solution, what's the next step? Is that deployed in Alipay in China? Is it deployed in Alipay around the whole world? What's the next for your solution?
We definitely want to promote a solution to the worldwide. A lot of the time, the payment company, it doesn't care about scam because it's not their loss. It happens to the banks as well. Sometimes banks think that we increase their transaction volume. But more and more cases, we figure out the bank also realize it's a social issue. It requires collaboration. Therefore, as long as we can collaborate with other parties to fine-tune the products, to offer them our solution to reduce scam, we would like to try it.
Sorry. And Glyn, if I can come back to you from Telefónica's perspective, then that's a UK solution now. Do you envisage that going into your other markets around the world?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think everything we do, and we have tended to start in the UK and mature the business there first, because we've seen various scams that we can, build solutions to defend against. That absolutely, we're in the process of rolling out, these B2B, first-party data insights via the APIs in Spain, in Germany, in Brazil, and in other Latin American markets. So yeah, it's a global product set, and not just for Telefónica, but also for the other telcos, for Vodafone, for DT, for Orange. This is a collaboration that's, I think, going to really benefit consumers and businesses.
Yeah, thank you. George, can I come back to you? When you were talking initially, you mentioned, I think you mentioned the enterprise solutions or branded calls for enterprise.
Yes.
Just tell us a little bit more about that, please.
Sure. So what we've done with Registered Caller, again, to piggyback on the STIR/SHAKEN implementation, is allow enterprises to sign up and store their information about the calling reason. They'll be using a certain telephone number, and so we would gather the call name, call reason, as well as logo, that this could then be used within the cryptographic signing and part of the certificates that go with phone calls. And for us, the reason why we're centralizing, I know we talk a lot about decentralizing in many solutions, it's the fact there's so many service providers, so many different analytic engines, so where can we get one set of information that we can trust? And so again, it's a collaboration of the ecosystem, getting the largest service providers behind it, and then building, effectively building a set of information that can be trusted and then utilized by the service providers in action. All of this is done in a way that also allows us to turn things off or be able to, go back, and if you have bad actors or somehow scamming the system, you want to be able to also take away those credentials, and that's one of the benefits of STIR.
I think it's super exciting, really super exciting solution. Keiron, now I can move it on because obviously we've been told we've got to wrap up in a few minutes. So if we were sat here in 5 years and we were reflecting on the last 5 years, what would success be like in terms of the work we've done to try and help fight these scam attacks?
So for me, the focus, and I've touched on it before, is it's more around the positive element as opposed to necessarily capturing the bad. So I think there's a huge, particularly in the UK, there's a huge amount of kind of educational work that goes on, and that's where typically most of this has been mitigated to today. What I would see in 5 years' time, assuming that humans are still roaming the earth, is that the problems will still exist. Yeah. But from a technology standpoint, we're in a much better position to help mitigate some of those issues and fundamentally keep the positive transactions flowing.
To add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, looking ahead, I guess, I think in 5 years' time, we want to be in a position where we can offer, as a telco, enterprises and consumers the ability to prove that they are who they say they are. Probably mostly on 4G and 5G, to be honest, and we've got a demo on 5G interactive calling with Ericsson on the Ericsson stand, in collaboration with them and Samsung, which is adding a great deal of context to calling and IP calling, and I think if we can achieve that goal of letting people prove who they say they are, we're going to really solve a lot of the scams, and hopefully they'll migrate somewhere else.
Yeah. So, forgive me, sorry. Can't get used to this. We need to wrap up because one of the things I've been told today, you've got to keep to time, otherwise once you never get it back. So I'd like to extend my thanks to all our speakers today. It's a really important area, and I'm delighted that they could come and share their thoughts on the brilliant work they're doing. So I'd like to thank George, Keiron, Glyn and Zhang for coming today and sharing their insights and thoughts with us. Thank you very much, gents.